that the Iranians could buy spare parts for their military. And this continued, and the Israelis were lobbying to get the United States and Iran on talking terms back in the 80s, even lobbying to make sure that the United States would not pay attention to Iranian rhetoric. This changed in the early 1990s, in which you have a complete reconfiguration of the geopolitical map in the region. The Soviet Union collapses. Iraq, the last standing Arab army that could pose a conventional military threat to Iran and to Israel, was also defeated. And you have an entirely new environment in which Iran and Israel emerge as two of the most powerful states in the region. And they end up in a rivalry for how the regional order would look like after the Cold War. It is this time, at this point, that you see both Iran and Israel undermine U.S. foreign policy issues and initiatives that they felt would be beneficial to the other. The Iranians started to target the peace process and reached out to groups such as Hamas and other Palestinian rejectionist groups that they previously actually did not have a good relationship with, in order to target the Middle East peace process, make sure that it failed because their calculation was that if it had succeeded, it would lead to Iran ending up into a prolonged state of isolation, which actually was part of the goal of the peace process, which is also part of the goal of the conference in Annapolis. It's almost more about isolating Iran than actually making peace between Israelis and Palestinians. From Israel's side, there was a fear that if Iran and the United States started talking, and if they managed to make a deal, come to some sort of agreement, the agreement would, to a certain extent, come at the expense of Israeli security interests. Where would Israel be in that dialogue? And I quote from several Israeli officials, and I think one of them was probably the most worthy of quoting, which was talking about that the Ayatollahs and the great Satan would make friends, and they would forget about the little Satan, Israel. And this was a fear. And even though at the time it may perhaps have been somewhat of an exaggerated fear, by today you can say that there is certainly more legitimacy in that fear, because if there is a U.S.-Iran arrangement, to a very large likelihood, it would end up giving the Iranians a limited enrichment program on Iranian soil. And to the Israelis, that's very dangerous, because that would theoretically give the Iranians access to technology that down the road could be turned into a nuclear weapon. And even if they don't go for a nuclear weapon, the fact that they have the technology would dramatically shift the balance of power in the region to Iran's favor and to Israel's detriment. And Israel would lose much of the strategic maneuverability that it's currently holding. It could, for instance, probably not impose unilateral peace deals on the Palestinians if there was a powerful backer on the other side. But I think at this stage, when we're standing on the brink of war, there are people waking up and realizing that this strategy is no longer working. My sense, though, particularly based on my last visit to Israel, in which I did meet with Mofaz and other people very high up in the Israeli government, is that Israel is in a strategic state of strategic paralysis. It is playing the chess game as if nothing has changed. The chess game it's playing does no longer actually exist. Because some of the key factors in the way Israel has viewed the situation are no longer there. Israel's deterrence has been shattered to a large extent by the war last year with Hezbollah. Iran is not that weak of a state. It already has 3,000 centrifuges. To completely reverse it is next to impossible, I think. And the United States, which is the strong ally of Israel, of course, and to a certain extent a guarantor of its existence, is in a very, very difficult position because of its own mistakes in Iran. To, under these circumstances, pursue with the same policy of trying to avoid a U.S.-Iran dialogue, more and more Israelis have come to terms that it's not a very good policy. It's going to end up being too costly. And if you pay attention to it, just a couple of days ago, Ephraim Halevi, the former head of the Mossad, who I interviewed extensively in the book, came out in an interview with David Ignatius in the Post, saying things that you rarely hear Israelis ever say, at least not publicly. Saying things such as there's no short supply of pragmatic people in Iran. You can deter Iran. Iran is not an existential threat to Israel. Iran cannot destroy Israel. Israel certainly can destroy Iran. And deterrence is going to be possible. Part of the reason why it's been very difficult for the Israelis to say this publicly is because because of a fear that if they reduce the pressure, if they reduce the rhetoric, it will take pressure away from the United States to go for a much more hawkish policy on Iran and go for an objective such as the zero enrichment objective, which the Iranians don't have in nuclear program. But more Israelis are recognizing, and another one is Shlomo Ben-Ami, who is the former foreign minister, who I'm very proud to say have endorsed my book, who's also coming out and saying, you know, in fact, the best way of advancing Israeli security and interest is through a dialogue with Iran, in which the Israelis use their friendship with the United States to make sure that Israeli security interests actually are on the table, instead of fearing that those would not be discussed and those would be sacrificed in the negotiating process. Now, earlier on, John, you mentioned the idea of 1938 in Germany, and this is, I think, an analogy that is deliberately being used by some people to prevent diplomacy, because they're thinking that through diplomacy, whatever the outcome would be, it would not be good enough, and because of that, it's better to pursue military action. What they're saying is that it is 1938, and Iran is Germany. And then they go on to imply that Ahmadinejad is Hitler. If we accept the premise of this analogy, that it indeed is 1938, Iran is Germany, and Ahmadinejad is Hitler, then which decision maker in his or her right mind would like to play the role of Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister thought that he could negotiate with the Germans? This is an analogy that deliberately is aimed at excluding, eliminating the diplomatic option. And if we eliminate the diplomatic option, or if we continue to miss opportunities for diplomacy, then unfortunately that would make war inevitable. But war, I don't believe, is inevitable. There is possibilities for it. And I don't know if I have any minutes left or not. 2 minutes. Let me just say one quick thing. Barbara mentioned the 2003 proposal. What was interesting there is you could really see that the Iranians were calculating that they will use the Israeli card and they will trade it away in order to have a better relationship with the United States. Because part of the thing they agreed to within the framework of the negotiations was to end all support for Hamas and Islamic Jihad, disarm Hezbollah, turn it into a mere political organization, and even sign on to the Beirut Declaration, the Saudi peace plan, which would have all the countries of the Middle East recognize Israel in return for Israeli recognition of the Palestinian state. That wasn't pursued. The Bush administration didn't respond to it. But a couple of weeks earlier, the Iranians had actually sent their former head of the IRGC, accompanied with 2 Iranian diplomats, to a conference in Europe, sponsored by an American university, funded by Pentagon, that attracts a large number of people from the region, about 3 to 4 times a year. I think the Iranians went there knowing very well that the key audience there would be the Israelis, because tons of Israelis go there every year. And the framework for the proposal was presented, not as a proposal to Israel, as a proposal to the United States, but I think the key audience for the Iranians were the Israelis, to make them understand that this deal would actually not come at Israel's expense. Now, we will never know, as Barbara pointed out, whether it actually would have led somewhere or not. And we will continue to never know unless the next time an opportunity arises, we actually grab it. We actually pursue it. We try it, and we'll see where we can end up. And I hope that that is something that we're going to do, although I'm not going to say that I'm too hopeful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker, and the final speaker, is Dr. Robert Litwak, currently the Director of International Security Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Dr. Litwak deals with the very highly charged and emotional issue of regime change. And his recent book is entitled Regime Change, U.S. Strategy Through the Prism of 9/11. I also understand that he